She thought she was doing me a favor. That's what my daughter actually said when she handed me the envelope, that she was doing me a favor. She stood there in her kitchen, her husband nodding behind her like a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times, and she told me it was time for me to figure things out on my own. She had no idea that I already had. My name is Raymond. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building something from nothing in a city that does not forgive weakness. And I learned early that the most dangerous thing a man can do is let people underestimate him. I never corrected that mistake when people made it. I just watched. I waited. And eventually, the truth had a way of announcing itself without any help from me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. I moved to Austin, Texas from Ohio in 1987 with $400, a used truck, and a contractor's license I had worked 2 jobs to pay for. I did not have connections. I did not have family money. What I had was an ability to look at a piece of land that nobody wanted and see what it could become. I bought my first property, a condemned duplex on the east side of the city, for $11,000. I fixed it myself, nights and weekends, for 8 months. I sold it for $44,000. I did that again, and again, and again. By the time my daughter was born, I owned 6 properties. By the time she started high school, I owned 43. I never advertised this. I drove the same truck for 12 years. I wore the same boots until the soles separated. I put my money back into the work, and then one day I looked up and the work had become something much larger than I ever planned for it to be. I kept it quiet on purpose. I had watched men who wore their wealth like a costume. And I had watched what happened to their relationships, their children, their sense of who they were. I did not want that, so I kept a simple life on the outside. I coached my daughter's soccer team. I grilled on weekends. I drove that truck. My daughter grew up, as children do, with a completely different understanding of what her father was. She knew I did real estate stuff. She knew we were comfortable. She did not know the scope of it because I never showed her. That was my choice, and I believed at the time it was the right one. I wanted her to build her own life, earn her own confidence, marry someone who wanted her, and not her father's bank account. She married Derek 3 years ago. He seemed fine at first, organized, ambitious. He worked in commercial real estate development, which I noted with some quiet irony, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never had a door closed in his face. He was 34. He had an MBA. He talked a great deal about the deals he was putting together, the investors he was cultivating, the trajectory he was on. I listened. I asked questions. I nodded. What I did not tell him was that 2 of the firms he had mentioned trying to get meetings with were firms I had done significant business with for over a decade. What I did not tell him was that I knew the names he dropped before he dropped them. What I did not tell him was that the city he thought he was learning to navigate was a city where I had been operating quietly, under the radar, for 30 years. I was not trying to trap him. I was just watching. My daughter and Derek bought a house 18 months after the wedding. A beautiful house, 4 bedrooms, high ceilings, in one of the newer neighborhoods on the north side of the city. They were very proud of it. They showed me every room on a video call before I visited. My daughter sent pictures of the backyard, the kitchen island, the master bath with its double vanity. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that the development company that built that neighborhood was a subsidiary of a holding company I had created in 2009. What they did not know was that when the builder had needed bridge financing to complete that phase of the subdivision, they had come to me. What they did not know was that certain arrangements had been made at closing that were entirely legal, entirely standard, and entirely invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. I am not telling this to seem clever. I am telling it because it is the truth, and because what happened next only makes sense if you understand the foundation. My wife, Patricia, the love of my life for 38 years, passed away in February. Cancer. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the last morning I held her hand. I do not have words for that loss that do not feel inadequate. She was the one who kept the house warm. She was the one who called our daughter every Sunday. She was the steady thing in a life I had spent in motion. After she was gone, I was not doing well. I will say that plainly. I was 67, recently retired from the active management of my business, alone in a house in the hill country that had always felt full when Patricia was in it, and now felt enormous and silent in a way that made it difficult to sleep. My daughter suggested I come stay with them. This was in April, 2 months after the funeral. She called on a Sunday, like her mother used to, and she said, "Dad, you should come be with us. Derek and I talked about it. We want you here." I said yes. In hindsight, I should have asked more questions. I arrived with 2 suitcases and my dog, a 7-year-old lab named Chester, who had been Patricia's dog first and was now the quietest kind of grief I carried with me. My daughter set up the guest room. She bought new towels. She cooked dinner the first night, and we sat at the table together, and for a moment it felt like something close to normal. That feeling lasted about 3 weeks. Derek worked long hours, which I understood. What I began to notice was that when he came home, there was a particular way he looked at me, a brief tightening around the eyes, a pause before he said hello, that told me my presence was not as welcome as my daughter believed it to be. He never said anything directly. Men like Derek rarely do. Instead, the communication happened in smaller ways. A comment about Chester being on the furniture. A pointed question about whether I had any plans coming up. A mention, said lightly, that the guest room might be useful for a home office eventually. I did not react. I observed. My daughter's name is Claire. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's instinct toward optimism, which meant she interpreted Derek's behavior as stress from work rather than what it actually was. She smoothed things over. She translated. She was, I realized slowly, doing a great deal of labor to make 2 men comfortable in the same house, and neither of us was making it easy for her. Then came the Thursday in October. I had been there for 5 months. I will admit, in a difficult stretch. I had been dealing with some paperwork related to Patricia's estate, not financial difficulty, but the bureaucratic weight of closing a life, transferring accounts, notifying institutions. I had let some personal correspondence pile up. I had missed a board meeting for one of my LLCs because I simply did not have the energy to participate. I was grieving. I was 67. I was sleeping in my daughter's guest room with my dead wife's dog. Derek came home on that Thursday at 6:15. I was in the kitchen, heating up the soup my daughter had left for me before she went to her book club. He came in, set down his bag, and stood in the doorway in the way that told me this was not a casual moment. "Raymond," he said, "we need to talk." He had never called me Raymond before. It had always been Ray. That one syllable, the full name, told me everything about what was coming. I turned off the burner. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, "All right." He sat across from me. He had clearly rehearsed this, because he started talking immediately, in the measured cadence of someone who has gone over the words enough times to iron out the hesitation. He said that Claire and he had been discussing the living situation. He said they were hoping to start a family soon. He said the house was not as large as it seemed, and that having another adult present made it feel crowded. He said he believed it was important for me to re-establish my independence. That phrase, re-establish your independence, spoken by a man who had never had his independence threatened by a single thing in his life. He said they could give me until the end of the month. The end of the month was 18 days away. I looked at him. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the $400 and the condemned duplex and 31 years of work that this man knew nothing about. I thought about the holding company and the subsidiary and the bridge financing and the arrangements at closing. I thought about a great many things in the span of about 4 seconds. Then I said, "Does Claire know you're having this conversation?" Something moved across his face. "We discussed it together," he said. "That's not what I asked." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I nodded slowly. I picked up my spoon. I said, "I'll start making arrangements." He seemed relieved, which told me this had gone better than he expected. He stood up, said something about us all wanting what was best, and went upstairs to change clothes. I sat at the kitchen table and ate my soup and thought carefully about what I was going to do. My first call the next morning was to my attorney, a woman named Gloria who had been handling my affairs for 19 years and who knew the full landscape of what I owned and controlled. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond, do you want me to look at the property records for their address?" I said, I already know what you'll find. She said, then what do you want to do? I said, nothing yet. I want to find out what Derek actually knows about his own situation first. Gloria said she would pull everything together and have it ready when I needed it. My second call was to a man named Thomas, who was the director of leasing operations for the property management division of my company. I asked him a series of quiet questions about a particular commercial development on the east side of Austin, a mixed-use project that had been in the financing stage for about 8 months. I asked him specifically about the lead developer on the project, a boutique firm that had been seeking an equity partner. Thomas looked it up. He told me the name of the firm. It was Derek's company, not the corporation he worked for. His company. He had left his salaried position 8 months ago, apparently around the time he and Claire had started discussing my living situation and had started his own development firm. He had not mentioned this to me. More significantly, he had not mentioned this to my daughter, because when I asked her that evening, carefully, how Derek's job was going, she said it was going well, that he was up for a promotion. She did not know her husband had left his job. She did not know he had started a firm. She did not know that firm was currently in the final stages of seeking the equity partnership that would determine whether it survived. She did not know that the equity partner they were courting was a holding company I created in 2009. I sat with that information for a week. I went through my daughter's house and I smiled at dinner, and I played with Chester in the backyard, and I watched Derek present himself as a competent, stable, successful man, and I thought about what Patricia would say. Patricia would say, "Be careful." She would say, "This is your daughter." She would say, "Whatever you do, make sure Claire is protected." That was the only instruction I needed. On the 11th day after Derek's conversation with me, I called Gloria and told her I was ready. I also called my son Derek, and Claire did not know about him, in the sense that they had never met him, because he was from my first marriage, before Patricia, and he lived in Seattle and ran a portion of my real estate portfolio from there. His name is Paul. He is 41, and he is one of the most precise and methodical people I have ever known. I told Paul what was happening. He was quiet in the way that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Then I began. Step 1 was the mortgage. The house Derek and Claire lived in had been financed through a lender that I had a long-standing relationship with, not ownership, but significant history. I asked my attorney to review the closing documents carefully. What she found, as I expected, was that the title insurance and a portion of the down payment financing had been facilitated through the subsidiary of my holding company, and that there was a clause in the builder's development agreement that preserved certain rights of the original financing party in the event of specific conditions. I am not a man who uses legal leverage casually. I want to be very clear about that. But I had an 18-day deadline and a son-in-law who had lied to his wife, and I had a daughter who deserved to make her choices with accurate information. Step 2 was the equity partnership. Derek's firm had submitted a full proposal to my holding company 6 weeks earlier. It was a good proposal, technically. He was not stupid, but it required a substantial equity commitment, and the decision had not yet been made. I had been deliberately out of that process, because I did not want my personal situation to influence a business decision. Now I asked Thomas to make sure I was on the next call. Step 3 was the most important one, and it had nothing to do with money or property or legal documents. It had to do with my daughter. I asked Claire to have coffee with me on a Saturday morning, just the 2 of us, while Derek was at the gym. We went to a place near their house, a small coffee shop on a corner, and I bought her a latte, and I told her that I had been doing a lot of thinking since Patricia died, and that I wanted to make sure she had everything she needed to build the life she wanted. She smiled. She said she already had what she needed. I said, "Does Derek talk to you about his work? About the business decisions he's making?" She said yes, of course. I said, "Has he mentioned making any significant changes recently? In the last 8 months or so?" The smile changed. "Not much, but enough for me to see it." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I want you to ask him tonight whether he is still at his firm, or whether he has started his own company. And I want you to ask him what the name of the company is." She looked at me across the table. She said, "Dad, what's going on?" I said, "I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm trying to make sure you have the same information your husband has. After that, whatever you do is your decision." She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. I paid for the coffee and we drove back in separate cars, and I took Chester for a long walk through the neighborhood, and I thought about my father, who had died when I was 29, before I had made anything of myself. I thought about what he would say if he could see where I had ended up, not the properties, not the holding company, not any of that. Just this. An old man walking a dog through a quiet neighborhood, trying to make sure his daughter didn't get hurt. I think he would have understood. That night, I heard voices from downstairs. I did not listen at the door. I did not have to. By the expressions on their faces at breakfast the next morning, I knew the conversation had happened and that it had been significant. Derek looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the polished professional confidence, something more uncertain. He had begun to understand, I think, that the landscape was not what he believed it to be. Claire asked me to stay another month. She did not explain why. I said that was fine. The following week, I was on the equity partnership call. There were 4 people from my team and 2 from Derek's firm, Derek and his business partner, a younger man named Travis. They did not know the name of the individual who would be making the final decision. That was by design. I was introduced simply as a principal investor. Derek's voice was steady. He had prepared well. He walked through the financials, the projected timeline, the comps, the exit strategy. He was good at his job, whatever else was true. When he finished, there was a pause. Then I said, "This is Raymond. Thank you for the presentation." The silence on that call lasted about 4 full seconds. I said, "I'd like to schedule a separate call to discuss terms." And I gave them the date and time, and I ended my portion of the meeting. Gloria told me later that Thomas had described the expression on Derek's face during that moment as a man who has just realized the building he is standing in belongs to someone else. I did not make him wait long. I am not a cruel person. I am not interested in suffering for its own sake. I called Derek directly personally, not through my office 2 days later. I said, "I want you to know that the business decision and what happens at home are going to be kept entirely separate. That is not how I'm approaching this." He said, "Raymond, I don't," and then stopped. I said, "I know you asked me to leave. I know you didn't tell Claire you had left your firm. I know you have a company that needs capital to survive. And I know that company has been in front of my team for 6 weeks. He was silent. I said, "Here is what I want to do. I want to sit down with you and Claire together, as a family. And I want us to have an honest conversation about where everyone stands. Not to embarrass anyone, because I think my daughter deserves to make decisions with complete information. That's all I want." He said, "What about the investment?" I said, "That decision will be made on the merits of the project." I meant what I said about keeping it separate. Another silence. Then he said, "When do you want to do this?" I said, "Sunday." We sat down that Sunday, the 3 of us, at the kitchen table in the house I had indirectly helped build in the neighborhood my company had indirectly helped develop. Chester lay on the floor by my feet. Through the windows, the backyard was turning gold in the afternoon light. I did not perform. I did not monologue. I just told the truth. I told Claire what I owned and what I had built. I told Derek what I knew about his company and how I knew it. I told them both that I was not there to punish anyone or make anyone feel small. I told them that Patricia's death had reminded me that the only thing that actually matters is whether the people you love know who you are. Claire cried. Not from sadness, I think, or not only from sadness, but from that particular disorientation of discovering that a person you know well is simultaneously someone you did not fully know. Derek sat very still. He was processing something. I could see him recalculating, recontextualizing the entire architecture of the past few months, the past few years. The father-in-law who drove an old truck and seemed like a quiet retirement-age man who needed looking after. Finally, he said, "I should have told Claire about the company. That was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "I should not have asked you to leave the way I did." I said, "No, you should not have." And then he did something I did not expect. He put his face in his hands, and he sat like that for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. He said, I have been terrified for 8 months that this company was going to fail and Claire was going to find out and she was going to think I was a fraud. And instead of handling that like a man, I took it out on you. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her husband with an expression that was complicated and clear at the same time. I said, "All right, that's honest. I appreciate that." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. About the company, about the investment, about what the next year was going to look like, about Patricia, about what kind of grandfather I might be someday, about Chester, who had fallen asleep with his head on Derek's foot sometime around hour 2, which I chose to interpret as a sign of something. I moved out the following month. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I had already made the arrangements I mentioned earlier, the ones I had started thinking about the night Derek sat across the table from me with his rehearsed speech about re-establishing my independence. I had bought a condominium on the top floor of a building in downtown Austin, with a terrace that looked west over the city, and I had furnished it carefully, with things that were mine and Patricia's and nobody else's. On the morning I moved out, Claire stood in the driveway and held on to me for a long time. She said, "I didn't know, Dad. I didn't know who you were." I said, "I know. That one's on me." She said, "Are you going to be okay?" I looked at the truck in the driveway. I looked at Chester, already sitting in the passenger seat with his nose pointed at the window. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the duplex in 1987. I thought about 31 years of work and the holding company and the subsidiary and the particular, patient pleasure of understanding exactly who you are and what you have built, not for show, not for anyone else, but because you were there for every single moment of it and you know it is real. I said, "I'm going to be just fine." The equity partnership was approved 6 weeks later. Derek's project broke ground in February. He called me when it happened first thing in the morning, before business hours, and he said, "Thank you. Not for the money, just thank you." I said, "Do good work." He said he would. I sat on my terrace that morning with coffee and Chester and the city spread out below me in the early light, and I thought about what my daughter had said. "I didn't know who you were." And I thought about how strange it is that we spend our whole lives in motion, building and deciding and working and grieving and starting over, and the people closest to us sometimes only see the surface of it, not because they don't care, because we forget to show them. I had a lot of time now to think about that. Patricia would have liked the terrace. She would have complained that the wind was too strong in the evenings and then stayed out there until dark anyway, wrapped in the blanket she kept on the outdoor chair. She would have been proud, not of the money or the property or any of the things that had unfolded over the past months, but of the conversation at the kitchen table, of the 3 hours, of the honesty. She was always more interested in what people did with hard moments than in the hard moments themselves. I am learning to be more like her. Chester is still here, still sleeps at the end of the bed, still wakes me up at 6 every morning, with his whole body wagging, like every single day is the first day he has ever been alive, like there is absolutely nothing in this world that cannot be approached with full commitment and an open heart. I keep trying to learn that from him too. Some mornings, I almost have it.